Star Trek's history with gaming has been somewhat checkered. On one hand, there are true classics such as Final Unity, Bridge Commander, and Armada, but on the other hand, there have been potential stumbling blocks, such as the game version of Generations or the mixed bag that was the Into Darkness tie-in game from 2014. But in a very short period of time, fans have been treated to two new games. Firstly, the more child-oriented Prodigy Supernova, and now, Star Trek Resurgence. Long in development and delays, Resurgence is now out in the world for fans to play, offering the most Star Trek gaming experience in years. Now let's be clear here, Trek Culture is not attempting to overview Resurgence as a full gaming review, because that's not for us to tackle. Instead, we're looking at how this game fares in terms of attraction to fans and the elements contained within that make it Star Trek, and not just a copy of something else. It's also wise to note that while this is a game available for the latest and greatest consoles such as the PS5, its price tag at around £35 or $40 backs up the notion that this isn't a AAA game. Definitely one for the fans, the host website for this game does tease that this is the base game, so it does indicate the initial story of the USS Resolute may not be contained to this adventure alone. Until then, let's take a look at what makes Resurgence tick in this list of ups and downs from Star Trek Resurgence. Let's start with storytelling, which is definitely an up. One of the biggest wins here is for the narrative-driven Resurgence forward. Placed in a style of a true Star Trek episode, the game treads a very familiar path. Placing the crew of the USS Resolute at the center of a galactic dispute is so very true to the franchise. It's also not without its twists and turns. Opening on what appears to be negotiations over dilithium mines soon becomes a mission of a far greater significance to those involved and the Federation itself. The very nature of this initial setup drives players into the opening of a story that echoes the ethos of TNG and DS9 era episodes, although there is actually more in play before the ship ever fires a single thruster. It's actually well worth diving into the prequel 5-issue Resurgence comic to learn more about the setup for the game, which explains the dynamic that newbie Jada Rydek finds when she sets foot on the Resolute for the first time. This adds a layer of depth to the story that could influence decisions along the way based on this knowledge of the crew. Yet at its core, and without that preceding knowledge, players can still dive into a story that has clear moral principles true to the franchise at its core, or choose to take a riskier path that branches into more conflicting narratives. Speaking of keeping with the franchise, we're also going to be giving Resurgence an up for its list of guest characters. Teased before its release, Resurgence brings a new crew into Star Trek as well as some familiar faces. Drawing on the TNG cast, Jonathan Frakes steps on board the Resolute by voicing Captain William T. Riker of the USS Titan. Although his role is perhaps not as significant as fans might have been led to believe, it's a key string to tie the game to the larger Star Trek universe and the time period in which the game is set. The larger and more unexpected cameo, however, comes from Ambassador Spock. His arrival in the game is utterly unexpected and naturally brings up the question of who will be tasked with providing the vocals. Step up Peter Michael, who does an impeccable job of channeling his inner Leonard Nimoy for what is a pivotal role in Resurgence. While he does get a mention elsewhere in this list, it's also worth a hat tip to the Tkon Portal 6-3, played this time around by Mark Rolston. Mark himself is a Trek veteran. Fans will recognize him as Waller Pierce from Eye of the Beholder, as well as Kuroda in Enterprise's Canamar, and as Klingon Mog in The Augments. Voice actor Deborah Wilson previously played Klingon Captain Tridge in Prodigy's Supernova Season 1 finale, and more recognizably as Lisa Cusack in DS9's The Sound of Her Voice. Here, she plays both the Resolute's Doctor and the Hatari Queen. Finally, Julianne Grossman tops out the returnees to the franchise, playing the ship's computer as she's done before on Discovery, as both the NCC 1031 and the USS Enterprise. Unfortunately, no game is perfect, and this will bring us to our first down. I can see character models' lips moving, but there's no sound.
Please do everything you can to make Commander Rydek feel at home here. I'll be on the starbase. I have an urgent meeting with the starbase commander to get our authorization to get underway. If they drag their feet any longer, the bridge is yours.
The core production of the game is where Star Trek Resurgence starts to fall apart a little bit. The story and the characters contained within are excellent and true to Star Trek's valiant history. However, visually, it occasionally looks more like an early 2000s PlayStation than a cutting-edge next-generation game. And again, to echo what I said in the beginning, this isn't a AAA game, so that's something we need to remember. From the start, there's echoing and duplicated lines. Speech cuts out on occasion halfway through a sentence, and disappointingly, the lips and the words don't seem to align. Pausing the game can cause some of these glitches to become more evident, and the graphics quality does differ even between narrative scenes, leading to a slightly uneven balance throughout. Resurgence might not be a AAA game, but it's also not quite what fans might have expected it to be on release. Even walking can be a challenge at points, with the motions of the character appearing less than fluid and at times verging on stilted. Trying to perform some of the simpler actions can be a strain if you want to pick up an engineering tool. Players can find themselves pushing their analog sticks to the limit to grab a console control at slow speed, but then in another instant have absolute precision when it comes to firing a phaser. At the end of the day though, it's a story-based game, and that's where the majority of the focus is, which is why that's our next up. Star Trek Resurgence is heavily reliant on its decision-making in-game. In the same vein as games such as Heavy Rain, or my all-time favorite game series ever, Mass Effect, the decisions you make affect the outcomes later in the game. Choosing a more thoughtful, slower-paced storyline, the game places key decisions in the hands of players themselves, rather than allowing the cutscenes to join the dots. The game could have chosen to rely on flying spaceships and phaser fights, which are very much the staple of Star Trek Online, yet instead tries something slightly different and thus offers more replay value. As the story reveals itself, both the lead characters face choices which not only affect the events that follow, but will also change the way in which they relate to other personnel. 3 options are given on each occasion, and there is only a limited amount of time available to make your choice, so it's more than advised to pay attention to the dialogue as players progress. If you're not tracking conversations and events, it might leave you high and dry when the game suddenly drops in a decision screen, so stay alert. To paraphrase a certain ambassadorial Vulcan, it provides infinite diversity in infinite combinations, meaning that taking up the challenge for a second or third time, players may travel different paths and outcomes. Story and decision-making are wonderful aspects of this game, but you can't have Star Trek without starships, and that's where it gets our next up. First seen in DS9's A Time to Stand, the Centaur-class starship was a kit bash utilized to trouble Sisko's captured Jem'Hadar fighter. Seen fleetingly across the final 2 seasons of the show, the popular Starship class takes a star turn in Resurgence. It also demonstrates a significant upgrade in the form of a main deflector dish, which was missing from the original design. As fans will recall, the original was mainly composed of the parts of the Excelsior class's primary hull, torpedo tubes, engines, and shuttle bay elements. Alongside the Resolute, the game returns the Type 6 shuttle that viewers were most familiar with from TNG, which itself was a chop-shop modification of the Galileo shuttle used for Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. In a fantastic twist, that craft also appears as the mode of transport used by Ambassador Spock to join the mission. In a superb cetacean observation, Spock's shuttle is named Grayson and is probably considered a classic due to the fact that it's one of NCC 2000 Excelsior's support craft. Early on at the onset of the mission, it's worth just counting up some of the familiar classes of starships docked around the Resolute, including the Nova class, made Trek famous in Star Trek Voyager's Equinox 2-parter. And much like Star Trek can't be Star Trek without ships, you can't have a video game without good characters, and that's where our next up comes in. Resurgence has 2 rather excellent leads in the form of Kobliot Commander Jara Rydek and Petty Officer Carter Diaz. Both offer unique perspectives on the game. Rydek is new to the ship, replacing the Resolute's recently deceased first officer, and suffers from a condition which means she requires regular transfusions of duridium to maintain her biology. Rydek allows players access to the bridge, the senior officers, and the main thrust of the mission. Certainly the more experienced of the 2 leads, Rydek is at the heart of the game's more impactful decisions in relation to the Hatari-Elydian relations. That's taking nothing away from Diaz, though, who transfers gamers down to the lower decks. In fact, he takes them even further than the ensigns of Lower Decks itself into the ranks of the non-commissioned crew. As an engineer, Diaz is an established member of the Resolute family, and at times offers a more hands-on approach to gameplay. His interactions are much less formal and tend to affect more of a close team game rather than Rydek's more objective command stance. And speaking of forming teams, let's give another up to how this game lets you influence the people around you. Actually, you know what? This part of the game is good enough to deserve a Latinum up. The heart of Resurgence comes down to its decision-making structure and paths that formed off of the back of those decisions. In many games, the cutscenes are optionally skippable, yet with Star Trek's latest edition, the narrative is an essential part of the experience. While on one hand, it is akin to watching an episode, there are a considerable number of points where Rydek or Diaz will be required to make one of 3 choices in their response to what is happening around them. This isn't decisions to fire a phaser or scan with a tricorder, but rather to interact with other characters and influence the outcomes. In turn, this nifty and very Star Trek feature of the gameplay means that fans will be affecting how their relationships with a selection of the other characters will progress. In Rydek's case, her choices will mainly affect the senior staff, as well as key players in the mission. As the game moves along, the relationship screen helps to keep track of how others react in a positive, negative, or neutral way, indicated by the green, red, or white edging around their character icon during the story. Building relationships with these characters is overall really enjoyable, but we do have one down that we have to talk about. As noted before, Carter Diaz is an established member of the Resolute's Lower Decks contingent, and as such has built up a number of relationships within that group. The most significant of these is with the alliterative security member Miranda Maris. Maris is returning to the Resolute as the story begins. This setup very quickly places her into a potential romance relationship with Diaz, which, thanks to untold numbers of previous storylines, pretty much indicates she'll turn out to be somehow intricate to the story. Add to that fans and players will just know that this relationship has to have a dire twist, and it delivers almost as quickly on it as it suggests. The need for there to be a romantic affiliation within Resurgence is perhaps questionable, since there's no real attachment to these characters at the start. Having Miranda just as a crew member who is caught up in the machinations of the Tkon would still have worked and perhaps have made the stakes just as high as Dramatic Labs were intending with their romantic link to one of the leads. That being said, the story overall is still really good and follows a very Star Trek-like episodic nature, which leads us to our next up. Well, it's kind of an up, kind of a down, but we're gonna give it an up. In keeping with the Star Trek format, Resurgence is split into a series of mini-episodes which reflects the televisual nature of the beast. Broken into 40 sections, each alternate between the 2 playable characters as they tackle different challenges as part of the main overall story arc. Each is in turn given its own very fitting and typically TNG-era title, giving only the faintest of hints as to what might be coming up. Certainly in terms of storytelling, this is an excellent feature, with each of the mission elements taking around 10 to 20 minutes to complete and involving various tasks and challenges to undertake. The big downside here, however, is there is no automatic save feature, which leaves players either having to ensure they complete each of the mini episodes to allow the data to be uploaded, or put their chosen platform into rest mode. Be warned though, that dropping into the relationship menu and accidentally flipping back to the main menu will mean that players need to start that segment again. This can be more than frustrating if you're one step away from completing a 20-minute piece and you need to do the whole thing over, which is exactly what happened to me. Now, not to give too much away, but the initial reason for the Resolute's mission isn't what it appears to be. It's not an M. Night Shyamalan level twist, but the result propels players into the history of the franchise, and specifically back to the first season of TNG from 1987, which means it gets an up. Resurrecting the Tkon Empire was a bold move. Rather than skirt around details, this game chooses to dive a bit deeper into the extinct race with the potential drama of their, to coin a phrase, resurgence. Treading a line around mind control and empirical rebirth, Players eventually find themselves back in the Delphi Ardu system featured in TNG's The Last Outpost, and even nods to the events of that episode. The Tkon themselves were briefly mentioned at a couple of other points during the franchise's long history, including as a headline on the Guardian of Forever's newspaper in Terra Firma Part 2. But this is the first time that any part of the franchise has chosen to expand on their story. Portal 6-3 even returns, although not voiced by Daryl Henriquez, who played the Guardian originally. Speaking of Star Trek aliens though, we're gonna give our last up to Resurgence for its new alien additions. Resurgence also brings 2 new alien races into the franchise in the form of the disagreeing Hatari and Illidians. Conflicting over their ownership of mining rights on the Tau moon, players are placed into a position where they will be forced to align with one of the 2 viewpoints. As you play through, however, this decision isn't quite as clean-cut as it might have seemed, and that's one of Resurgence's top points. You can only make decisions on what you know of the situation as the story evolves. You might have more of a leaning towards the Illidians, who claim to be the original rights owners to the mines, or perhaps the Hatari, who see it as their moon. But as events progress, there are more layers to each of the races, and thus the black and white choices become much more cloudier shades of gray. Indeed, this is absolutely true of a Star Trek story where one viewpoint is no less valid than the other. The reintroduction of the Tkon Empire only adds to the murkiness of the waters around the 2 new races due to its integral nature to the game. But what Resurgence does succeed at is building the relationships between the lead characters and both Hatari and Illidians to make them just as multifaceted as any creation for the TV show or movies.
It's a tactical simulator that makes the Kobayashi Maru look like a
Down.
from Pintar's.
And there you have our list of ups and downs for the new Star Trek Resurgence game. Let us know in the comments section below how you've been enjoying the game so far. If you want to keep up with us outside of YouTube, then you can follow us on Twitter at TrekCulture or on Instagram at TrekCultureYT. You can also find me across various social medias at TrekkieBree. Until next time, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and don't forget to live long and prosper.